Chinese leaders are hearing more criticism about their decision to set up an air defense identification zone over the East China Sea. A White House spokesperson called the announcement unnecessarily inflammatory. Japanese officials want the Chinese to revoke the measures. Chinese officials announced on Saturday that they had set up the zone. It includes airspace over the Senkaku Islands. Japan controls the islands and maintains they belong to the country historically and in terms of international law. China and Taiwan also claim them. The Chinese said aircraft entering the airspace must now notify them of flight plans and obey instructions. They warned of emergency defensive measures if their instructions are not followed. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe called the creation of the zone very dangerous. He said it could escalate the situation in the region and lead to unintended consequences. And he said the measures have no validity on Japan. Japanese officials plan to work with their counterparts in the U.S. and other countries to have the Chinese retract the measures. White House spokesperson Josh Earnest said disputes in the region should be resolved diplomatically. A Pentagon spokesperson says U.S. forces will not change how they conduct their operations. Colonel Steve Warren says U.S. pilots won't register their flight plans or identify themselves.
On this episode of China Uncensored, China's perfectly reasonable air defense zone. Hi, welcome to China Uncensored. I'm your host, Chris Chappell. Ladies and gentlemen, and Wu Maos, I have a very important announcement to make. During my scholarly research that I love to do so much, I came across a map that shows that the eastern portion of Canada clearly belongs to me. This map was made 500 years ago, and its authenticity is beyond questioning. This has been a part of my sacred territory since ancient times. That's why, as of 10 o'clock local time, 2 o'clock GMT, I'm establishing an air defense identification zone over the region. Any aircraft entering my airspace without properly identifying itself will be shot down. And let me just get ahead of my critics out there. The sudden appearance of this map has nothing to do with recently discovered untapped reserves of poutine in Quebec. That's why I'm taking China's side on their air defense identification zone that they just put up around a huge chunk of the East China Sea.
China is standing firm on its new air defense identification zone for the East China Sea. Announced on Saturday, the zone contains islands known as the Diaoyu to China and the Senkaku to Japan, claimed by both countries. Beijing's decision to impose an air defense identification zone in the region will mean Japanese aircraft flying over the disputed islands will now have to obey Chinese rules or be subject to what China calls defensive emergency measures.
The Chinese government is establishing the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone in accordance with the United Nations Charter and other international law and practices. The purpose is to safeguard China's sovereignty and territorial and airspace safety.
America has a treaty with Japan to defend territories under Japanese administration, including the islands. U.S. Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel immediately condemned China's plan as a destabilizing attempt to alter the regional status quo. Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has also called China's plan very dangerous and demanded it be scrapped. In the 1970s, China and Japan came to an agreement to acknowledge their conflicting claims to the islands and shelve the dispute for future generations to solve. China says the Japanese government ended that agreement last year when it bought 3 of the islands from private ownership. Chinese experts say their country only refrained from imposing an air defense zone out of respect for the agreement, and that Hagel's remarks show hypocrisy.
We are not the ones who broke the status quo, and now we are just making good. We did not do this before, and it was only a matter of time. Whether in the East China Sea or any of our marine territory, as with any neighbor with whom it has overlapping air defense zones, Japan will have to negotiate.
China's foreign ministry says Japan should take responsibility.
China's Ministry of National Defense has issued new aircraft identification rules covering the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone. The new rules state that all aircraft flying in the zone should report their flight plans to China's Foreign Ministry and Civil Aviation Administration. If an aircraft doesn't supply its flight plan, China's armed forces will adopt emergency defensive measures in response. The announcement states that China's Ministry of National Defense has full administrative rights over the zone. The Defense Ministry has included a precise demarcation of the Air Defense Identification Zone. For more information on that,
the dispute between China and Japan over a group of islands in the East China Sea has escalated again after China designated an Air Defense Identification Zone over the contested area. China's Defense Ministry released this map detailing the new defense zone. In orange, you can see the boundary for China's territorial waters. The red line shows the new defense area, and if you look in the bottom right of that area, you will see it includes the islands in dispute. To the Japanese, they're known as the Senkaku. The Chinese call them the Diaoyu, and they have been a major source of tension between Asia's two biggest economies for decades, as the islands are a rich source of oil, natural gas, and fish. The BBC reports China's new air defense zone went into effect at 10 a.m. local time Saturday morning and will require aircraft passing through to report a flight plan, maintain two-way radio communications with China, and respond in a timely and accurate manner to aircraft identification inquiries. China's new air defense zone overlaps with Japan's previously established air defense zone, which military analysts say could increase the potential for a confrontation between Chinese and Japanese military aircraft operating in the area. According to the Wall Street Journal, U.S. officials have said they fear that such a clash could escalate into a military confrontation between China and Japan that could also drag in the U.S., which is obliged to defend Japan under a 6-decade-old security treaty. Tensions between China and Japan first escalated earlier this month after Japan announced it would shoot down Chinese drones if they flew over the disputed islands, something China said would amount to a, quote, act of war. For Newsy, I'm John O'Connor.
Fox News alert and a bit of a military poke in the eye by the United States to the communist Chinese. Walter Russell Mead just mentioned it. U.S. jets are challenging China's air defense zone. Overnight, 2 B-52 bombers were sent over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. China is now claiming that those islands fall into its air defense identification zone, or essentially airspace that it controls. Japan also claims those islands, and the United States just wanted to essentially weigh in on the side of the Japanese by sending a couple of B-52s flying over those islands last night in an operation that they called Exercise Coral Lightning. The Pentagon also says the U.S. will ignore any requests from the Communist Chinese to identify aircraft flying in that zone.
Japan on Wednesday defended the United States' decision to send 2 unarmed US B-52 bombers on a training mission over disputed islands in the East China Sea without informing Beijing and defying China's declaration of a new airspace defense zone. The move, which raised the stakes in a territorial standoff, did not prompt a response from China, the Pentagon said, and the White House urged Beijing to resolve its dispute with Japan over the islands diplomatically, without resorting to threats or inflammatory language. Japan called on China to retract its claims immediately. China published coordinates for an East China Sea air defense identification zone over the weekend and warned it would take defensive emergency measures against aircraft that failed to identify themselves properly in the airspace. Tokyo said Japan's Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida had received reassurances from the United States Secretary of State John Kerry that Washington was supportive of Japan's stance on this issue. The zone, about 2/3 the size of Britain, covers the skies over islands at the heart of the territorial dispute that China has with close US ally Japan. The B-52 bombers carried out the flight, part of a long-planned exercise, on Monday. China claims almost the entire South China Sea, conflicting with claims from Taiwan, Malaysia, Brunei, the Philippines and Vietnam.